I was surprised to learn that there's a pretty large group of Halo fans that cannot stand the Flood, which is strange to me. I always thought that the parasitic space zombies were a huge part of what defined the original Halo trilogy. I mean, that twist reveal in Combat Evolved is still one of my favorite moments in gaming. And looking back on it, I don't really remember anything from the later games that would ever make me hate the Flood. So, as a lifelong fan of the franchise, it's time for me to step up and defend one of the greatest threats to ever terrorize the Halo universe. But before I can actually do that, I have to figure out why people hate the Flood in the first place. After spending a whopping
16 minutes
scouring the internet, I started to see a few comments that kept popping up. Starting with, the Flood are just space zombies. They don't have any personality of their own. Alright, yeah, in a lot of ways, the Flood are like zombies in space. The first game didn't give the Flood much in the way of complexity. They eat everything, the Halo rings were built to stop them, and it's up to the Chief to blow them into tiny bits of space dust. The Flood were intended to be a force of nature, an unstoppable wave of death, while the role of a more traditional villain was given to 343 Guilty Spark instead. That all changed in Halo 2. The Gravemind showed that the Flood wasn't a mindless infection. There was intelligence behind the rotting flesh and tentacles. What had been a cut-and-dry fight against space zombies was suddenly turned on its head. What happens when you and the monsters have the same goals? What happens when you're fighting the same enemy? That level of ambiguity, the idea that the mutated abominations could just as easily be your allies or try to eat your face, that's not a direction that many zombie stories are willing to go. Granted, the Gravemind wasn't handled especially well in Halo 3, only ever appearing as tentacles or a voice in the Chief's head. And the bizarre pacing throughout the end of that game didn't really give his storyline much in the way of payoff. Even so, the idea that the Flood are just space zombies doesn't really hold up once you start looking at how much their role in the story evolved and grew across the original trilogy. The Flood are boring to fight against. They're dumb, bullet-spongy enemies. Yeah, but isn't that the point? Fighting against the Covenant requires tactical and strategic play. They're incredibly smart and constantly pushing players to take advantage of every tool in their arsenal. The Flood is the opposite. Players are forced to fight defensively, backpedaling while unloading into a seemingly endless, unstoppable horde. They don't require the same cunning to take down. There's no need to try and outsmart them. It's a huge change of pace, and I can understand why some fans didn't like it. Fighting against the Covenant is so fun and so engaging. Why take that away? The answer is variety. Bungie wanted to make sure that players were engaged from beginning to end, and introducing the Flood as a secondary enemy faction was one way to do that. Think about it. Not only did the developers introduce an entirely new style of gameplay, but the three-way battles that ensue when the Flood, the Covenant, and the Chief collide are some of the best moments in the game. In Halo 2 and 3, the Flood's impact on combat continued to expand. Their appearance on Delta Halo gave players a chance to fight against human weapons and armor, and the evolved pure Flood variants in Halo 3 added depth beyond the simple combat forms. Were all of these changes successful? No, not all of them. And later games in the series went on to prove that Halo didn't need the Flood to keep the gameplay interesting. So, I'm torn. While they aren't quite as refined as their Covenant counterparts, the Flood still served as a way to inject the series' combat with a bit more variety. They're an important part of how the original games were designed, even if the developers never truly perfected said design. Have you played The Library? Or High Charity? Or Cortana? This is easily the most prevalent argument against the Flood out there, and, well, if the main problem with the Flood is the levels that they're in, doesn't it make more sense to hate the level design, not the enemies? Let me be clear. I know that levels like The Library and Cortana are seriously flawed. The Library is 40 plus minutes of flat hallways and locked doors, while Cortana is a confusing mess of claustrophobic tunnels and flesh-colored grossness. They're not fun to navigate, they're not fun to play through, they're not well-designed levels. But that's not really the Flood's fault. Don't get me wrong, the Flood don't make those levels any better, but they're not the reason those levels are so bad either. Think about it. Would waiting for doors be any more exciting if the Covenant were the ones shooting at you? Would Cortana be any less obnoxious if grunts and jackals were the ones clogging the hallways? Conversely, if the Flood are the real problem, why do Flood-centric levels like the Maw and Quarantine Zone still work? Also, High Charity. Really? Yeah, it's a tough level, but it's also creepy and dark and atmospheric. If anything, it always felt like the Flood level that people had been hoping for back in Halo 1. It's so aesthetically on point, and I don't have any issues with the actual gameplay or design, so yeah, I'm lost on that one. Look, I'm not trying to tell you that the Flood is the best thing to ever come out of Halo. Each iteration of the Parasite has its flaws, and I can sympathize with some of the reasoning behind the most common criticisms. I mean, I will always love them, though it's not all that hard to see why some people don't. But flawed as they may be, I hope that you can at least appreciate how much of an impact the Flood has had on Halo. They're more than zombies in space, they're more than some second act plot twist. They were a way for Bungie to give Halo a narrative curveball and gameplay depth at the same time. And when the criticism came, the developers continued to iterate and improve on their design rather than taking the easy way out and leaving them on the cutting room floor. True, they are far from perfect, but at the end of the day, Halo just wouldn't be Halo without the Flood. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to help the channel grow, you can always hit that subscribe button, or if you feel like it, make sure to go to patreon.com/brokenbase. I am already working on my next project, so until then, I'll see you guys next time.